Welcome to my 2022 hurricane season prediction. First, I would like to say that hurricane season predictions are pretty much a guess of what's gonna happen. I won't be specific with any locations, states, countries, or single storms. These predictions are there to predict general patterns or tendencies, and if one claims that they can predict one specific storm months in advance, they are just selling snake oil. So let's start. When we look at the current SSTA setup, we have a pretty robust looking La Nina, fueled partly still being held alive by this negative PDO, this cold horseshoe on the North American coast of cooler SSTAs, and this surrounding this core of really warm SSTAs. So this La Nina pattern is usually favorable for the Atlantic hurricane season activity, because if this region is warm, we get convective activity here, which causes outflow, and this is a major contributor to wind shear in the Atlantic. Also causes stronger trade winds, as we have the rising cell here, which has to be compensated by flow in this direction. So from a Pacific sea surface temperature sense, we have a pretty favorable pattern for the Atlantic this year, but the Atlantic pattern, at least for now, doesn't look optimal. We have the MDR, the main development region, which is pretty much the most important region to look at when considering Atlantic activity, because we have most hurricanes coming from Africa, going through the MDR and then forming into major hurricanes. Those are the most storms and the most major accumulated cyclone energy donators of the season. And this region is a bit below normal. We have a few cold spots throughout here. So this has been caused by continually strong easterly trade winds, which have been upwelling cooler water from the Canary Current into the MDR. But we see maybe some changes in this pattern, as we see here on the GFS. We have a big low pressure system in the central northern Atlantic, and this is expected to continue. And when you have low pressure above, it rotates in cyclonic direction. You have westerly winds below, so we have those westerly anomalies throughout the main development region. And the warmest waters in the Atlantic currently are situated in the Caribbean, so it pushes the warm Caribbean waters into the MDR and causes a pretty substantial warming. So you might expect that we have in a few weeks this entire region not as below average as it seems now, but more slightly above average to average. Can also see this westerly anomaly here, pretty substantial looking westerly anomaly throughout the main development region, so might expect some pretty substantial warm up of the Atlantic. You can also see what has been warming so far. A bit of warming in the eastern Atlantic, especially here south of the Cabo Verde Islands. Some nice warming going on. So we might still see a little bit of change in the configuration of the Atlantic, which isn't optimal now with this warm blob near the United States East Coast and the cooler tropics, because when you have the tropics stable, you have most of your hurricane activity coming from the tropics. You won't have anywhere near as much hurricane activity. You can still have hurricane activity in the subtropics, but you don't get as much hurricane activity there. You can also see that on a plot where I have the most active hurricane seasons throughout the last few years. SST anomaly throughout those years in April, the current month, and we have this typical positive NAO horseshoe shape, warm in the deep tropics, warm Canary Current, and a bit cooler near the United States East Coast. And when you look at the current pattern we have, it's pretty much opposite. We have cooler throughout this entire region with the Canary Current, with the MDR, and warmer in the United States East Coast. I've seen someone pointing it out, but I think we're gonna see some warming additional to the warming that is coming up with the westerly anomalies. And that is, we had throughout the last 10 years, we had consistently the MDR in September being warmer from an anomaly standpoint than in May. And from April to May, we're likely gonna see some warming with the westerlies. And then from May to September, we have always seen some warming of the MDR in respect to the May SSTAs into September, which has been probably mainly caused by the West African monsoon being substantially stronger than normal throughout all those years. It's been really, really strong the last 2-3 years. And we can also see this trend of warming in the MDR, which is expected on this climate ensemble of throughout multiple climate models. We see the MDR here in April depicted cooler than normal, and we move it up to September, we see substantial warm up of the MDR. We also see a bit of a Atlantic La Nina pattern, you could call it. So that might be an indication that we have a anomalously northerly intertropical convergence zone, which could lead to anomalous precipitation throughout the tropics. If this Atlantic La Nina pattern develops, I think the MDR could get a little bit less active, because when you have an easterly anomaly throughout here, you don't have as much environmental vorticity to create storms. So when this pattern actually verifies with the Atlantic La Nina or the Atlantic Nina, we might see hurricane activity a bit more focused to the Western Atlantic, less from the MDR. And this Atlantic pattern is pretty good, but it's not optimal. Still, we have this pretty big warm blob in the subtropics. This might be a little bit of a problem, which in terms of it might steal some thunderstorm activity away from the tropics, where it is most effective at developing hurricanes. So when we have big anomaly here, you need compensate a big rising anomaly here, where you need compensating sinking anomaly in the tropics. So we had, through the last few years, we had also a big subtropical SSTA anomaly, and this has led to more of those very short-lived, very trashy, very weak-looking storms. So I think this year active hurricane season is pretty much on the board with this La Nina pattern sustaining throughout the year. We don't have as much convective activity throughout the Pacific to lead to enough wind shear to disrupt a lot of the hurricane activity that's gonna happen, I think. But also, we likely gonna have a hotspot near the east coast of the United States, where you could have increased number of those very weak subtropical, extratropical origin like storms. So we might have a pretty non-quality season, much more on the quantity side, where you have like 19 or 20 named storms, but only 7 hurricanes, 3 major hurricanes, or something like that. So this climate model sustains La Nina pretty well, warms up the Atlantic. This is a pretty favorable pattern. The Atlantic configuration is not entirely optimal, so we're looking at a active hurricane season, but not super hyperactive. When you look at the hyperactive hurricane seasons throughout the last year, how they look, you have this little bit of tripole pattern, very warm in the tropics, cooler in between, and then warm again in the extratropical regions of the Atlantic. And when you look at the climate models, it doesn't really show this kind of pattern. It shows a gradual gradient of increasing SSTAs when you go up to the Canadian coast. So now let's focus on the Pacific. So the Eastern Pacific is likely to be suppressed throughout this year with the La Nina. When you look at the current SSTAs, you have kind of this warm blob in the Pacific, which might still steal some of the thunderstorm activity from the Atlantic, might especially suppress some of the activity in kind of this region, because when you have strong rising air here, you need compensating sinking air near that. So I think we might have this year increased hurricane activity near Mexico, very eastern part of the Eastern Pacific. It's pretty similar story to the Atlantic. A lot of named storms, maybe not as many long track significant hurricanes. And I think the Central Pacific is gonna be very inactive, as it typically is with a La Nina, pretty substantial La Nina. When you have strong easterlies in the tropics, you have it very difficult for enough environmental vorticity to develop here in the Central Pacific to have those tropical cyclones develop, and also the stability that just comes with it. The sinking air is just overwhelming for the Central Pacific, which in a normal year produces just a few storms. So Eastern Pacific may be above average for named storms, below average for accumulated cyclone energy. Atlantic, as I said, above average in both categories, but may not have this much of a ratio from accumulated cyclone energy to named storms, which you normally expect in normal seasons. So probably a below normal quality season, so a lot more trash storms. And the Western Pacific, I really don't see an active season. I have seen some people thinking it gonna be an active season using analogs that I think are flawed for this year. But the Western Pacific, it is warm, but this is not the how you would usually forecast the Western Pacific. The most important things for the Western Pacific forecast I noticed is the sea surface temperatures just east of the Western Pacific, which are very, very cold, and also the PDO signature, and both of those are unfavorable at the current time. Pretty nice negative PDO, which induces ridging over those areas, stronger than normal trade winds, stronger than normal wind shear. A lot of those Western Pacific warmth goes into the Indian Ocean monsoon, and not into Pacific typhoon activity. And when you look, I put a composite index of some of the more inactive Pacific hurricane seasons. You see this exact pattern: warm Pacific in the Western Pacific, very cold just east of the tropical Western Pacific, and this negative PDO signature. So for the Western Pacific, I really don't see an active season. I see maybe really an active season, because this La Nina is pretty robust. This PDO is much more robust than last year. And last year was really inactive for the Western Pacific. 2020 was okay, probably because this PDO signature wasn't as strong as it was 2021, 2022 now. So I think the Western Pacific is actually gonna be less active than maybe both 2021, 2020. Maybe we're gonna get like 20 named storms, and a few typhoons. I think a lot of those typhoons are gonna be focused more to the Philippine Sea, maybe in the South China Sea, but I won't get more specific. So I think inactive typhoon season, inactive Eastern Pacific hurricane season, at least from the perspective of long tracking hurricanes, active Atlantic, but especially in the perspective of lots of named storms. So I hope you had a nice time looking at my general thoughts on the hurricane season, and yeah, I see you next time.